All right, looks like a couple people are filing in to today's webinar. Guys, for those that are jumping in a little bit early, we're going to get started in just a minute or two. Boris, you locked your cats out? Are they going to be scratching at the door?
Yep, hopefully.
For those that have joined, if you hear any whining in the background, we promise it's not a crying baby. It's just a hungry cat on Boris's side. We'll do our best to mute them.
Definitely not hungry, but yeah.
They're always hungry, those trash cats, you know? All right, for a couple of those that have just joined in, we got a couple more joining. We're going to get started in just around 30 plus seconds. For those that have already joined, since we got a bunch already in the lobby, you guys will notice you guys will be muted throughout this webinar. Please note that you do have access to the Q&A or the chat function. Please add all of your questions there. I'll remind you guys again, as of course we go throughout, as this is going to be an interactive webinar. We want to make sure that we're answering all of your questions. But just a couple more seconds, letting a couple others filter in here, and then we're going to get started. All right, I think we've reached critical mass. So for those that entered in just in the last couple seconds, thank you all for jumping in here. You guys are here to learn a lot about security and design focused around IoT security at scale. Quick housekeeping before we get into the details of the presentation and webinar today. You'll all be muted throughout this webinar, but please be interactive through the chat and through the Q&A. It's going to be your biggest thing. Hopefully you guys can all see that on your sidebar below or to the right-hand side. Please add questions there throughout the webinar. Don't wait until the Q&A. I'll be monitoring them so that I'll be able to ask these questions throughout our conversation, as this is really an important topic and one that I want to make sure that each one of your individual questions are being answered, as it's going to help this conversation. But again, thank you guys all for jumping on here and joining us. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about IoT security at scale. And mainly, we're going to be focusing on 12 very critical steps. You guys may notice that we said 11 in the webinar invite. We've added an extra for free, won't charge you. 12 critical steps to secure your connected devices. And the reason why we're talking about this today, we actually just got back from a major trade show in Las Vegas called InfoComm. And for those that are in the AV industry that joined us at this trade show, this was truly an eye-opening year, not just for us, but I think a lot of the folks walking around this trade show. I think it was already known that, especially in the smart building, smart space, smart city world, that devices are becoming more and more connected, that we're finally implementing the beautiful acronym of IoT finally, and not just using it as a collection of letters. But the biggest thing I've noticed from this trade show was that connected devices and the cloud associated with those connected devices is becoming a de facto standard. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have. It's not a nice to have for customers, but now a demand from customers. And the biggest last step is ensuring that that strategy to get to an IoT business model and implementation of IoT, it must be secure. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. And we've got a very special guest to join us, who we'll introduce in 1 second. For those that don't know who I am, my name is Andrew Gross, and I run our global sales team here at Xyte. But most importantly, we have Boris Dinkevich joining us to really walk us through these 12 critical steps. And Boris is our CTO and co-founder here at Xyte, and he brings around 25 years of experience in both public and private sector work around exactly this specific topic, which is designing an IoT strategy, designing devices, and implementing a secure strategy. And we're going to be talking a lot about that. But Boris, why don't you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Thank you very much, Andrew. So my name is Boris Dinkevich. As Andrew mentioned, I spent most of my career in software development. I never knew that I'll end up here discussing cloud security. Who knew 25 years ago? I started my career at something that used to be called a system, but now it's called DevOps, managing large enterprise networks. Continued on through being an embedded developer, a Linux kernel, and embedded devices, and then graduated to the world of web, where I previously had a company specializing in consulting and training in different web technologies, and a company specializing in large-scale technical events and conferences. And 4.5 years ago, I joined Omer, my co-founder, and together we founded Xyte.
Awesome.
That's basically it.
Thank you, Boris. In summary, a lot smarter than me. And so we're going to let Boris do a lot of the talking here on today's webinar. But before I do hand it back to Boris, quick agenda, what you guys are going to get in for the next, say, half hour. I'm going to quickly set the stage, guys, on why we're even talking about this. I know I mentioned we came back from a trade show and there was a lot of good findings from there, but I want to talk about this from a broader IoT sense. I'm going to give you guys some facts and figures around the devices and security as a whole. But then I'll let the expert do the talking here. And Boris is going to dive deeper into a 12-step program into how to design an IoT strategy at scale and make it secure. We're going to dive into a couple of them. Got some good questions to ask him as well as we go on throughout. But again, please add your questions as he goes through these 12 steps, as I think that's going to be the most important takeaway from today's webinar. The other thing to note is that for those that maybe need to cut out early or simply joined us late, not only will this be recorded and send it out to you guys who have registered, we also have some awesome resources online. If you guys go to the Xyte.io website, we've got a blog post and a white paper that talk about these 12 steps and go a little bit deeper into them, all written out for you. So if you want a nice summary page, you can go to our website and see those as well. So without further ado, why are we even talking about this? I'm going to actually focus on the left-hand side of these facts and figures because, again, we're going to send this to you guys afterwards. You can read through them a little bit. But I think we've all already accepted the fact that IoT is not just here, it's not just growing, but it is a must-have from a strategic standpoint to grow business and not lose business near into the future. A couple quick facts and figures. I think the biggest thing here is both the growth and the sheer volume of IoT devices. We're seeing a 20% growth year over year for enterprise IoT. That connected things strategy is clearly on a trajectory that even our own expectations we're not ready for. But the biggest number here, I think, is one right below that, which is around 30 billion devices are going to be connected up by 2027, nearly double what we've experienced just 1 year ago. And now with 65% of device manufacturers having a full IoT strategy as of 2023, even higher as of this year in 2024, if you're not on this train already, you're missing out on business. And that is the only takeaway, I think, to really gain from these is that there's clearly business to be had, but more importantly, you're losing business if you don't already have this IoT strategy. But in general, what's all happening here, and the reason why companies are implementing this, and in the next couple of years, the vast majority, if not 100% of manufacturers will have this strategy, is about delivering value to your channels and to your customers. But the biggest thing here is to ensure with an IoT strategy, the biggest balance with IoT is to ensure that that value continues to outweigh the risk associated with an IoT strategy. And that risk are security threats. And unfortunately, they're on the rise. As more devices are being connected, it simply is a greater opportunity for bad actors to get access to data. So quick explanation of the graph that you're seeing here. And again, you guys can look at this as we provide this later on as a follow-up. This graph is provided to us by Checkpoint. And what you're looking at are number of IoT attacks per week per organization. And they're separated, of course, by region. It's a pretty alarming number as you're seeing an average of 55 attacks per week per organization around the world. So although you clearly need and require an IoT strategy, as you'll be missing out on business, if not going out of business without it, you have to be smart about it. And you have to continue to ensure that the risk does not outweigh the value that you are bringing. So I want to jump right to the real meat of this presentation and not waste any more time on the obvious of we got connected devices and they better be damn secure or we're going to be open to security risks. But how do we do it? And unfortunately, it's not easy to just start from scratch and just figure out how to make a secure IoT strategy. But luckily, with Boris joining us, we have a fantastic blueprint to walk you through 12 very clear steps and explain how it's done correctly. So Boris, I want to bring you back in here. And I'd love for you to kind of give the folks here a little bit of an overview of what we're looking at, and then let's dive deep into each one of these 4 categories.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. So it's important to note it's not really steps per se, but rather important things that you have to take into account while you're building up your cloud presence. And we divide the different steps into 4 categories. The first one is about preparation, and it is the design you put into the system and the way you prepare your engineering and operational teams. The second one is coding concepts. It's more of how do you actually do the code, how do you maintain the code, and how to ensure as little risk as possible to come from that side. Infrastructure, of course, is a huge deal about securing your infrastructure, securing your connected devices. And of course, compliance, while it's not exactly tied into security, it does have lots of relevant parts and lots of ties back into security. And nowadays, especially if you're planning to operate in European markets, compliance is critical to be able to even launch. So I think let's start with the first phase, which is the design concepts. So here there are 4 main things that we think at least, deserve lots of attention. The first one is the whole idea about user roles. And that is not just the initial part where you authenticate the user so you know who it is, but it's rather the authorization part, what that user can do in the system. And in the cloud, when devices are not connected, there's a lots of authorization issue about who can access which device and what level, which roles, because you want to be able to group people. And this feature, we have seen it before, that some companies just start with something basic. The idea in the beginning is that we just connect a couple of devices, we'll have a few customers which are having 1 or 2 users, so there's no problem there. But as you scale up and you start selling to organizations that have tens, hundreds, thousands of users, you have to build a system that allows those users to have very granular access to devices and to spaces inside each tenant. And I think one of the biggest things that I've seen during our consulting time especially is that if that is not something considered during the design phase, retrofitting a complex authorization framework is extremely hard, extremely expensive, and extremely error-prone. So it definitely should be thought of during the design phase as an internal part of your system. The second thing is that unlike more of a legacy solutions where you would sell it as an on-prem solution for one company, since you're going to be running your software in a cloud with multiple organizations connecting to it, the multi-tenancy approach must also be considered in the design phase. And that is the idea that devices, users, or any data belonging to one organization can never leak to another one. And unfortunately, we've seen lots of hacks that happen through that. Someone gaining access to one organization, then being able to get information from others because multi-tenancy was not properly enforced. It can be on database level, on the application level. Again, lots of options, but must be considered during the initial stages. And the third one, which sounds kind of obvious, but privacy by design actually means training your team. Most developers, especially if they don't come from the cloud world and the web development, are less aware of the idea of what privacy means. And usually training and code reviews ensure that developers always think about the data they're holding now. Is that piece of data private information that has to be handled under GDPR? Is this information handled by coming from a device? Who should see it? How it should be stored? All that has to be considered during the design phase because doing it later, it's virtually impossible. And the last part, because we're not talking about a regular SaaS platform, but rather something with connected devices, is what's happening on the device side. So we must also set up protocols to ensure that devices connected to the cloud are connected in secure fashion, but also know how to correctly authenticate with the cloud. So we don't get fake devices or mischievous devices connected to our platform and ruining the data or making something weird for your end customers.
So
Boris,
if I could just jump in quickly, I'm just, when I'm hearing a lot and when I think of like design, right, I think a lot of early stage, right? I design something and then I move on to the next steps. Is this entire design concept and all the 4 that kind of make up it, is this kind of like a set it and forget it? Or is this something that kind of bleeds in throughout the next 3 stages as well?
So actually, it's a very good question. I was almost about to cover it. So good thing you raised it is that unlike maybe legacy waterfall models, for those who are familiar with that, it's not really design, code, launch, and forget. Modern ecosystems, especially in the cloud, we're continuously adding new features, improving stuff, changing features and fixing bugs. So the design concept in this case is more of, you do need to do some very in-depth design before you start, but then any new feature, any new change requires the design steps again. To consider any change we make, so if we, I don't know, with warranty support, we have to figure out who can access the warranties, how they're affected by multi-tenancy, what data we collect. So all these steps you'll see here are just continuously happening non-stop, in parallel. All right, so let's skip to the coding part. So we have a developers chain, we have some initial idea how to build the cloud, and we've done some POC to understand that everything actually works in a secure, performant way. While doing the development process, there are a few things we strongly recommend for you to do. The first one is using static code analysis tools. There is a bunch of different tooling out there that can automatically read source code and try to determine if there are any potential security threats or bugs hiding in the code that developers haven't noticed. We personally take these tools and integrate them directly into our development flow. So any changes a developer wants to make are automatically scanned for possible errors and security risks, and can never be even added to the main code base if one of those static codes fail. As a side note, there are also dynamic code analysis. Software that runs while you're running, even in production, and monitors from the side what's happening with the main code base, trying to catch unexpected behavior. I think any of those tools are very strongly, sorry, my cat is screaming outside. All those tools, we strongly suggest use the tools, of course, depending on the platform you use and the coding language you use. The second super important part is peer reviews. Any piece of code entering our code base has to be reviewed at least by another person. And for more secure and sensitive areas, we recommend a extra 2 pair of eyes. So we usually have one teammate reviewing the code from another, and then the team lead or the software architect reviewing the commit one last time to catch architectural problems or anything that someone might have missed. So those two first things were using software to check the code. The second was having developers check the code. And there is a third part, and that's using an external team to check the code. And here, penetration tests come into play. Some of the maybe bigger organizations might have internal security teams. Most companies outsource this to professionals. And the goal of a penetration test is to have a team of white hat hackers, basically, come in and try to break into the system. That means both trying to attack your APIs, attack all your endpoints, and even better, giving them full access to the system itself. So for example, giving them regular access user, administrative user, and them trying to get to areas in the system that were not supposed to be accessible by that role. So really play around with the system as deep as possible. For more extreme cases, you can provide them with their source codes. So they can even do a security review there. We can have the penetration tests periodically on our code, just to make sure that nothing crops in.
Perfect. And Boris, before we get to the third grouping of infrastructure, actually we have a question that came in, and it was related to the pen test and the peer reviews. The question was asked. They said, we certainly have heard about penetration tests being performed by third parties. Do you recommend peer reviews also being done by third parties, or is that an internal only step to take?
So generally, usually peer reviews are done only inside the company, but there are a few exceptions. I can give an example of something that we have. We had a feature that we launched a while ago that we felt was high security risk because it was a new service connecting to our main database. In that case, we hired an external company both to do penetration tests on the new service, but they also did a code review of the service itself, just for extra security. So if you can afford it and you have the time, it's definitely recommended.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, let's move over to the infrastructure.
Right. So the infrastructure part actually might be one of the complex parts, and that's once we finish the coding, we have a system running. Where do we run it? So the most important part, of course, is secure hosting. Is where do you put the code itself? Hopefully, it's not a laptop in the basement. Some stuff that's been done 20, 30 years ago. Nowadays, you need an environment where you have servers, database, automatic failover, multiple availability areas. So if something happens in one region, the whole system doesn't go down. Of course, things like backup. And beyond just the software security, there's a big part to physical security as well. So you might have the best antivirus software running, the best firewalls, but if someone can just walk into your office, go downstairs to the basement and walk up to the server, all that will be for nothing. In most cases, the recommended approach, of course, is using the well-established infrastructure providers, Azure, AWS, and others. They have very well battle-tested security principles. Their hardware security is, of course, way better than most companies can afford to do, both from access and even phishing attacks. So they have personnel trained to avoid social engineering and other possible problems. They are not a simple solution. Even there, you'll probably have to get a professional consultant or hire a professional DevOps, because setting up those environments correctly with correct user access is very, very difficult. And many times people fail actually on that. So they have very secure software, that they use the AWS, everything is perfect, but whoever was setting up the AWS account didn't set up the correct access right on some user, and someone managed to just get inside and wreak havoc on machines that they should not be able to access. Another important bit is data encryption. Many of you probably heard the concept of data security at flight and at rest. And the idea here being that even if your data is stored in the database, on the disk, or in your backups, it should always be encrypted. So even if someone somehow steals the physical machine and hooks it up at home, without having the keys, they will not be able to access the data. And that's double true for any backups you do, and especially, I actually seen it personally, some developer at a company I consulted for downloaded some backups locally so he can debug an issue, ended up having full production data on his laptop, and the laptop got lost. It was not a happy day for anyone. So data encryption at rest is very important, but also data encryption at flight. And the meaning is when data is sent from your device to the cloud, or from the cloud to the end customer, or through APIs, you want to make sure that it's also encrypted there at any part of the way. This prevents melt-in-the-middle attacks, as someone might be just snooping or setting up even an access point in the internet cafe and having you by accident connect to it. You want to make sure everything's encrypted, TLS, HTTPS, MQTT-S, all the protocol have an S at the end for security, and it's strongly recommended to use them, and it's double important for devices. So your device should never send raw data on the network. Everything should be fully secured from the device and forward. And that place also, just a small comment, SSL certificates, very important, again, preventing man-in-the-middle attacks. I just want to stress that all the things you mentioned here as kind of overarching concepts, there's lots of diving into each one of those, and they should be done carefully with someone who really understands what they're doing. And the last part of the infrastructure is not really security, but touches security in a way, and that is continuous backups and disaster recovery. When I started 20-something years ago doing DevOps, we used to have differential backups every hour or every 2 hours. Nowadays, systems can do continuous backup. That means everything is being backed up all the time. And if we have a catastrophic failure, we can actually jump into the last moment when the backup is still working and lose as little data as possible for the end customers. Most platforms nowadays offer continuous backups, but again, very important to make sure that you have a system where you do periodic disaster recovery exercises, where you actually test that you have not just backups, but actually restores.
And Boris, hearing you kind of go through these from the hosting standpoint, and the backups, I mean, it sounds like a lot of cloud stores, especially these encrypting mechanisms. I mean, is this really one of where companies are seeing the highest bill? Like, is this the most expensive step from your point of view?
So luckily, no, and that's mainly due to economies of scale. Nowadays, you can get amazing servers and amazing software running on those servers for relatively low prices. Again, it depends on your engineers. You can build a scalable solution that scales to millions of devices on a relatively cheap AWS bill, and you can spend millions on AWS with only a few devices if you really done it badly. The main issue for the IT world is actually the data, saving the data, both the logs and the actual information, and accessing. So if someone wants to see historical information for a device, that usually poses the biggest problem we have, because the amount of data you collect on IT is truly enormous. So cataloging it correctly, indexing it correctly, and making sure you don't do any duplicates is super important for cost. But in the end, the biggest cost usually is manpower, the developers, the DevOps, the product managers. They by far at least one order of magnitude beyond the bills for infrastructure, usually.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right, let's move over to the last bucket of compliance.
So compliance, as I mentioned, it's not a direct security risk, but it's tied into security world. Anyone selling in Europe has to be GDPR compliant. As a SaaS platform, there are lots of other standards around the world. Some are mandatory, some are optional. At least we at Xyte try to comply to as many as possible. Mainly the rationale being that your end customers, especially if they're a big organization, have trouble working with companies who don't have different compliances. And having as many of those as possible make it way easier for a security team to approve the system, because otherwise they might just not be able to use it. GDPR compliance is the minimum because you still collect some information about customers, and you have to make sure that it's well segregated and safe. But something that's not direct compliance, but very tight in security, is device level audit logs. And truly, that's not just device level. It's generally audit logs on anything happening in the system. Because of audit logs, you gain two very important things. The first one is retrospection. If something happens, you'll be able to see what happened, hopefully catch the problem and fix it in the future. And the second one is to set up alerts and rules. And when something happens that appears to be anomalous, you get notified immediately and hopefully can fix the issue. Because I don't know if I think one of the things that Andrew showed in the previous slide was the SolarWinds hack, which, if I remember correctly, went unnoticed for months and months, just because no information was collected to catch that. And also audit logs, of course, are covered by different compliance protocols as well, so it ties out well into the compliance and security.
Yeah, and Boris, as we're moving into the next section, because we're actually getting a lot of questions in, I want to make sure we have time for Q&A in the next couple of minutes. But one thing that came up as well was when we talk about compliance, and I think somebody probably saw this on our website, is where does SOC 2 Type 2 compliance come into play here? Is that part of this? Is it overarching around these 12 steps? And maybe explain a little bit what SOC 2 Type 2 is.
So the SOC 2 Type 2 compliance is actually not a compliance like a GDPR compliance. It's a compliance that a company can voluntarily undergo that has some very, very, in my opinion, very good rules for a company to follow. It covers many aspects of the company, financial, sales, but it also touches a lot of development and the security. For example, SOC 2 requires your company to do at least annual pen tests on your production code. And as part of SOC 2, they even verify that you've done it and review the reports. They make sure that you have audit logs. So one very good example of what I like about SOC 2 compliance is that every week we have to check the audit logs of all the systems that we use as Xyte and make sure there is no weird activity there. And also once every, I think, 3 months, we have to check all the access rights and make sure that there is no former employee that somehow have still rights to production database because someone forgot to remove it. So SOC 2 compliance will probably force your company to be way more secure just because someone is checking and verifying it.
Got it. Okay, so it's a set of best practices. It's a specification almost of like how to handle all of this together. It's a good set of rules, I guess, to follow. And I know, at least in my own conversations, Boris, that I've had with other manufacturers that have worked in our platform, as well as customers, that SOC 2 Type 2 kind of badge of honor has been massive for those that know what it is. In terms of timing,
By the
I
way,
actually, oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, one small thing about SOC 2 compliance, it's also a very network effect because for us to be SOC 2 compliant, we have to make sure that all the infrastructure we use is SOC 2 compliant. That means that any organization that wants to use your cloud and they are SOC 2 compliant, they might be forced to have you be SOC 2 compliant as well. So SOC 2 compliance is it's beyond just internal; it's also an external feature.
Yeah, it does have that chain reaction. Perfect. So in terms of timing, guys, for those on the call, I want to make sure that we have enough time to get your questions. You asked some really great ones. The last couple slides, this last slide here, we're going to skip over quickly, but really what we wanted to talk about was, we're setting the stage of these 12 critical steps to kind of walk through when securing your devices and getting into a device strategy. But even as you begin to dive deeper and double click into each one, each individual step has its own set of rules to kind of govern itself as you start to implement things like authentication, user roles, audit logs, and alerts. And actually, I highly recommend to expand beyond just this slide, take a look at the blog that Boris wrote on the Xyte website as he dives a little bit deeper into each one of those. But the real kind of summary here before we get to the Q&A, and all of this, of course, was hopefully not too scary, that there's a lot to take into consideration, but it is a lot, right? That there's a lot of considerations, a lot of strategic steps that need to be taken into effect when implementing an IoT strategy, especially for an organization that isn't just focused on implementing an IoT strategy, but is also focused on making great hardware. And now as you're implementing a cloud that surrounds this, new tools and resources for your channel partners and your customers to take advantage of the IoT feature sets that your devices are now bringing to the market, this type of security is paramount. And one of the big things I hope you all can take away from this webinar is that although you now have the knowledge, don't think that tomorrow you now have to go and build and implement and hire people and spend money and resources into doing this only on your own. You're not on an island. This is where Xyte comes into play. Although we're not the one-stop shop for everything, but if you are looking to implement a cloud-based monitoring and management strategy, we are here to help. In our platform, we support these complex authorization protocols. We enable high-level controls down to level of permissions of single devices, and you'll never lose sleep over privacy issues as it relates to your devices, your channel partners' access, the tenants, and of course, your customers' private information. And we really do recognize the importance of respecting all of these privacy rights of individuals, as well as the needs of our customers in being compliant with things like GDPR, national data protection laws, and of course, as Boris left us with in the last slide, a SOC 2 Type 2 type of compliance and set of rules that we follow very strictly across our entire organization. So with that, I did want to get to a couple questions as we do have a couple minutes. If there's any other questions that people want to add, please continue to add it here to the chat. But Boris, I'm going to kick this off with the first one that came through, and it was specifically related to Xyte, but how does Xyte handle PII, which I believe stands for Personal Identifiable Information?
So PII is part of a GDPR compliance, and I have to say it's not an easy thing to handle PIIs. From our perspective, we've been very careful to figure out where we collect personal information, and we try to keep, we keep anything related to private information inside the end customer's tenant. It never goes outside. It's not data that will ever be sent to devices, because unfortunately there's no ways to enforce what's happening on edges in devices. So that information kept inside. It's usually not accessible by any APIs as well. Again, to make sure that the data doesn't go forward to any other processor who might not be GDPR compliant. And that information automatically is fully deleted when customers might decide to close their account. But the main goal was here again, it was kind of the first concept that we showed. From the beginning, we identified all the fields of data that are PII and made sure that developers understand what that information means and keep it fully scoped inside the end customer tenant and far away from any devices.
Got it. All right, let me jump over to this question. I think this is important as the question comes, it says, we're looking to use the Xyte platform to offer a cloud-based tool that supports firmware delivery. How do you ensure that firmware delivery is secure?
So I'm kind of divided into two places. The first one is the delivery of firmware, how you get it. And the second, of course, what's happening on the device level. So there's lots of options to make sure that the device can only run secure firmware that's been signed by the manufacturer. But maybe something that's more relevant for a cloud platform is the secure delivery of firmware. And since we're using the cloud, it becomes actually way easier. So previously, firmware updates can be delivered over a CD-ROM, USB key, sent over email. It's very tough to verify that the file is correct. You can, of course, use signatures and publish signatures, but most customers will find it very difficult and confusing, and will just download the file they found online and put it on their device in the hope that it's safe. But when we're using a cloud platform, at least what we can do with Xyte is that the hardware manufacturer has their own area where they can upload firmware files that, of course, they validate on their site, and devices will only get firmware from our server. That means there is no way for an end customer, let's say, there's no way for an attacker to push code to a device without being explicitly allowed by an end customer. So data is firmware is over updated by a manufacturer. I'm going to say there is a special case where a manufacturer might provide a temporal or a fixed firmware to test something and send it to the end customer by other means. So we do provide that option, but it's only per device basis and should be done with the user when fully understand what they're doing. And of course, at any moment, they can just switch to proper official firmware for platform.
Great, thank you, Boris. So we got time for one last question. It looks like it was somebody that met us at Infocom. What they asked was, we spoke to you guys at Infocom, and we need to build a cloud to offer our customers the ability to connect their devices to the cloud. From a manufacturer's perspective, how do you connect devices to the cloud securely?
Actually, excellent question. We didn't fully cover it, but connecting the device is actually not an easy thing. First of all, it depends, of course, on the protocol. So if you're using, let's say, more of the standard protocols, or more open protocols, we'll say, like HTTPS or MQTT, it's one way. But if you're using protocols like maybe LoRaWAN, they have everything built in for secure communications. But if we're talking about HTTPS and MQTT, which are more common, at least nowadays, it's not an easy proposition, because the more secure the connection, the harder it is for the user to claim the device. That means the most extreme solution is using TPMs, which is a trusted model, platform models, which are actual chips sitting on your inside your machine. They can do save encryption keys and do cryptic operations, and then we can verify with very, very high degree of certainty that the connection is secure and the device is what it's saying it is. Otherwise, any step below that, it will open up the device to potential problems. So you have to be very careful to understand what edge cases might happen from the security world. At least on Xyte, what we're trying to do is that, since we know that how the manufacturers can't really go for the most secure method most of the times, to try to catch as many strange activities from the server side, to catch misbehaving devices. But the minimum is, of course, always having TLS, so you can do HTTPS connection and MQTT connection to the server, always verifying the SSL certificates that are not fake, but coming from a trusted authority. And I think defining the protocol of how a device authenticates to the server is critical. And on that one, I don't have any suggestions. Really sitting down with someone who understands architecture well and figuring out all the edge cases. We've done it when we started, and back then we also hired an external company to kind of overview our architecture to try to think if we missed something. And I'd like to say we didn't, but we still added lots of checks on the server side to test ever something becomes unusual.
Yeah, I mean, even a company like ourselves, who is focused 100% on building an IoT platform to be secure, we can always get better, and we're always continuing these types of tests and following these 12 steps day in and day out. And I think that goes to kind of the entire theme here of this conversation, which is how important security and the almost the nonstop nature of innovation around security and staying up to date around best security practices are just so important. And it really does take a company to really focus on it 100% of the time to make sure it's done right. So thank you, Boris, for going through these questions. I apologize for those, we didn't get to all the questions. Really appreciate you guys being so active in here. But if you do have any other further questions, please do feel free to reach out to either of us directly. You can reach myself at Andrew@Xyte.io or Boris directly at Boris@Xyte.io. And thank you all for jumping on here, and hopefully you're able to gain a lot of great insight into the importance of not just implementing an IoT strategy to ensure that your business is staying around for years to come with, of course, the change in the market that is occurring, but ensuring that the value of your IoT strategy continues to outweigh the risks. And with the security practices that we've gone through today, clearly there's a lot to take into consideration. And hopefully we at Xyte can be an ease of your mind and ensure that you don't have to lose sleep over implementing that strategy and ensuring that it's secure. So thank you, Boris, for your time and your insight. It was incredible. I learned a bunch from this, so this was awesome. I think it was fantastic. And again, we will follow up with everybody who has registered and has joined this webinar with the recording, as well as I highly recommend you guys check out our website at Xyte.io and take a look at the blog and the white papers that Boris has helped author that go into these security steps in much, much more detail. But we do look forward to working with all of you guys a lot more, not just on your IoT strategy, but of course, ensuring that it's done secure and at scale. So thank you guys all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew.